Do you remember Gus and Yak, the cheerful little mice who lived in Cinderella's kitchen? They were clever and resourceful, always finding crumbs and bits of food to keep themselves well fed. One chilly winter evening, as the frost nipped at the edges of the windows, the two mice were nibbling on some delicious cheddar cheese from the larder. Between bites, Yak paused to reflect. You know, people always say, poor as church mice, he mumbled, his words muffled by a mouthful of cheese. I bet that means they hardly get anything to eat. Gus nodded solemnly, his round belly wobbling slightly. That must be awful, he sighed. I wouldn't want anyone to go hungry, especially not our cousins who live in the church. What if they're starving? Yak tilted his head thoughtfully, then grinned. I know, let's take them some of this cheese. They'll be so happy. With excitement, the two mice scurried to the larder and found a big, round, red Dutch cheese. It was as large as both of them combined, but the determined little mice weren't about to let that stop them. Together, they rolled the cheese out of the kitchen, across the castle floor, and into the frosty street. The cobblestones were cold and slippery beneath their tiny paws, but they kept pushing, inch by inch. Almost there, Gus puffed. Just as they reached the middle of the cobbled road, the sound of clattering hooves and squeaking wheels startled them. A large carriage rumbled toward them, its driver calling out commands to the horses. Move, 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 Yak squeaked in panic. But before they could get the cheese out of the way, the carriage rolled right over it. The big, round cheese was squashed flat, and half of it was gone. Gus and Yak stared at the crushed remains in dismay. Oh, dear, Yak murmured. Well, at least we've still got half. Quick, Gus. We must get this to the church before we lose any more. They hurriedly began rolling the flattened cheese toward the church, but their troubles weren't over yet. A large, scruffy dog came trotting down the street. His nose twitched and his eyes locked onto the cheese. Grr, he snarled, his sharp teeth gleaming as he lunged toward it. Gus and Yak squealed and darted behind a bush. Double quotes, do you think he'll leave us any? Gus whispered anxiously. The dog sniffed the cheese, licked it, and began gnawing on the edge. There will be nothing left, hissed Yak, peeking out from the bush. But before the dog could finish his snack, a sleek black cat strolled by, tail high in the air. Double quotes MIAOW. The dog's ears perked up and his head whipped around. Forgetting all about the cheese, he barked loudly and chased after the cat, disappearing down a side street. Relieved, Gus and Yak scampered back to the cheese. It was dirty, chewed at the edges and smaller than ever, but they didn't have time to waste. Hurriedly, they rolled it the rest of the way to the church. As they neared the grand stone church, they noticed flickering candlelight glowing through the stained glass windows. The scent of wax and old wood filled the air. At last, they reached the warm, candlelit interior of the church. Gus and Yak were out of breath but proud of their accomplishment. Our cousins will be so grateful, Gus said with a smile. But to their surprise, they found two plump, sleek mice lounging comfortably near the altar. Their coats were glossy, their bellies round, and they looked anything but starving. We thought all church mice were poor, Gus exclaimed, his eyes wide. And thin and hungry, added Yak. We brought you this cheese. The church mice chuckled, their whiskers twitching with amusement. Poor church mice? Oh no, that's just an old saying, one of them said. The choir boys who sing here bring us plenty of snacks, crumbs, bread, and even biscuits. And when they don't, we eat the church candles. The wax is surprisingly tasty. The other church mouse smiled kindly. Thank you for bringing us the cheese, though. You must stay for supper. Gus and Yak hesitated for a moment, but the delicious smells wafting from the church mice's feast were too tempting to resist. They joined their cousins for a meal of cheese, potato crisps, chocolate, and even a few candle drippings. As the mice laughed and shared stories, Gus and Yak told them about Cinderella and the grand castle. The church mice listened with wide eyes and begged for more tales of their human friend. This is the best meal we've ever had, Yak murmured, his mouth full of chocolate. When it was time to leave, the church mice insisted they take a bundle of snacks home. Gus and Yak dragged the bundle back through the frosty streets, their bellies full and their hearts warm. As they passed by the market stalls, Yak noticed something he hadn't before: the bakery. The scent of fresh bread filled the air. Next time, he whispered to Gus, we should bring a loaf of bread too. Gus chuckled. One thing at a time, Yak. When they neared Cinderella's castle, Yak sighed happily. Shall we go and live in that church? It's warm and full of food. Gus shook his head. No, Yak. We could never leave Cinderella. She's family. But one thing's for sure, I'll never believe that old tale about church mice being poor again. And with that, the two mice scurried back into the castle, ready to tell Cinderella all about their adventure. When they got there, Gus and Yak went over to Cinderella and told her about their adventure today. Cinderella listened well, occasionally chuckling at the stories of their struggles. Cinderella also gave them a cup of tea. That night was a very long day for them. Gus and Yak sailing Bertakar Sarita Sasakali Mereka juga mempergikan payung terjadi di sana membuat Cinderella terkikah.